A24 has been on fire for nearly a decade now, and their latest release, David Lowery's The Green Knight, is no exception. How does a low-budget pagan Arthurian epic even get made? Who do we owe a kidney for making Dev Patel a fantasy hero? Should I be wearing pentacles? What does any of it mean? Don't worry, my humble knights. Be ye clueless to the wherefore art whatever of the color green? I am here for you. You have my sword. You're undoubtedly familiar with the Round Table where Arthur's brave knights gather, the significance being it has no head, so all who sit along it are equal. With the whole court gathered to celebrate Christmas Eve, and you could almost miss that this is the table. It's a cut half circle instead of the traditional rounded table. Whether that's symbolic or not, well, you'd have to ask David Lowery, but it certainly adds to the claustrophobic and vulnerable feeling of the scene once the Green Knight arrives. One of the earliest symbols to appear is the Pentangle, a 5-sided star. It looks similar to the pentagram, but for Jesus reasons, it's very different. Gawain's shield is fronted by the holy symbol, which is true of the written story too. It's worn by Arthur and Guinevere, as well as the Knights of the Round Table. It's on the floor, hugged by the half table used in the film, and is seen from above when the camera pulls back to reveal the Green Knight's pool of blood and axe at Gawain's feet. That pentacle represents the 5 knightly virtues of piety, generosity, courtesy, chastity, and friendship. Arguably, all of these appear to Gawain, although not given by the Green Knight. He skips Christmas Mass to be drunk and kiss, only gives a single coin to the scavenger who assists him, asks Winifred what's in it for him when he retrieves her head, fails chastity big time at the keep, and friendship? Never heard of her. The most beautiful and eerie detour is that of St. Winifred. St. Winifred of Wales is a key figure of religious folklore. Haunted by a prince called Caradog who wished to marry her, she was soon to become a nun. When she rejected him, Caradog beheaded her, making Winifred the victim of a beheading game in a way. The Welsh story says where her head dropped, a spring formed. In the film, Gawain must dive into the pond to retrieve her skull, and Gawain does not see her home until after he takes a sip of water from the spring. In a film that centers nature, it's not surprising for animals to play a significant role. But Lowery wasn't just riffing here. The questing beast is a crucial element of the Arthurian tales. It has inspired modern stories: the stag and the lion, the witch and the wardrobe, various entities in Magic the Gathering, and familiars in the novel and television series The Magician. A bear suddenly appears in the background of the film, which I didn't even notice until the third watch, and when Gawain arrives at the keep, he is greeted by a silhouette that might be a bear holding a lantern. Gawain is joined by a fox who ends up speaking, which holds the dual relationship to the questing beast and initially invites the audience to trust the fox as a various Celtic mythology. The fox is a symbol of wisdom and stability. Although for me, the fox is sus. I can't get into it here. Do not take your place among the idly, Guinevere says to Gawain as he shows insecurity at having no legendary tales to tell his uncle Arthur like the knights around him. Story and legend play a crucial role in the film. People throughout the land acknowledge Gawain as a living protagonist. Even the Lord and Lady know the tale of Christmas Day. The Lady expands the sanctity of legend with her library, filled with more books than Gawain has ever seen, and tells him that she even writes them. Stories, songs sung to me. I write them down, and when I see room for improvements, I make them. Speaking to the ever-changing nature of myth and legend, fitting for a 21st century adaptation of a 14th century story. So what's the film canon pronunciation of Gawain? Good question, and we don't know. If you thought the varied accents in the film were playing tricks on your ears, they weren't. Director Lowery intentionally let actors pronounce it based on their own research. A drunken man in the pub says Gawain. Arthur says Garwin with a clear and present R, and the Lord and Lady say something close to Gaon. This is reflective of how we interpret something as small as a name differently and change a story, tying back to the aforementioned theme. Additionally, no one outside of Gawain and Essel are named. Merlin isn't named, Lord and Lady Bertilock in the books are just Lord and Lady. Gawain's mother is Morgan Le Fay, but credited as Mother. Even Arthur and Guinevere are only credited as King and Queen. Alright, real quick, I'm taking you to church, but then right back out of there. Christianity and paganism find themselves going head to head as a huge part of the text, not just the subtext. Entire degrees have been dedicated to this sort of thing, but here's a quick rundown. The crosses in King Arthur's court versus the often crumbling crosses found in the wilderness, including the one outside of the Green Chapel, the slow spread of moss over the constructed stone of men. There's a stunning parallel of a priest blessing Gawain's shield, which has the Mother Mary on the side closest to him, as his mother and ladies in the waiting chant offer the green girdle. As the scavenger leads Gawain across the dead of battle, the bodies become more and more covered in dirt and mud. Let's get into the various meanings of green. Green with envy is a phrase we all know. Green has been used to describe illness since at least Macbeth. Gawain says it represents rot, and the lady states it's what lust leaves behind. In the medieval era, however, green itself represents lust, because of the conflict of the natural and feral with the devout and orderly. The film takes on a blurrier meaning, with the green of nature pointing to illness and corruption in man, but the green of the wild ultimately being what Gawain must confront to become a true knight. Two very important magical figures appear in the film. Gawain's mother is the infamous Morgan Le Fay. She's Arthur's half-sister and sometimes lover in the original tales. Yikes. She is in the OG story, but is Gawain's half-aunt and only meddling for the sake of scarring Guinevere, then has to keep it up when Gawain accepts the challenge. The magic man himself, Merlin, is here. He gives Arthur the bro don't eyes when the Green Knight cordially invites everyone to play a beheading game, but this isn't a short film, so he's ignored. In the final version, Merlin takes Gawain's bastard son away from Essel. If you missed him, he's the only gentleman at the court with the face tats. Every frame of the Green Knight is something straight out of David Attenborough's NyQuil Fever Dreams, but this symbolism is special for the big old green man himself. What's the deal with that holly? I'll tell ya. Holly, the evergreen plant with those lovely red berries, is used by pagans in celebrating the winter solstice, and so was adopted by Christmas. In both cultures, it is a symbol of peace. The Green Knight brings the holly and holds it up to communicate, "We cool?" Moss is not so significant in the source material, but Lowery wields it brilliantly as it begins to fill up the film, adding a thriving purity to the more pagan elements. Moss has a significance in the folklore of healing in Germany, Finland, and Celtic nations. Even in a film with heavy mysticism, witchcraft is sovereign and significant. The film uses runes and ogham, an early Irish alphabet, in preparing the green mantle central to the story. Ogham rods surrounding the fire and ruins are sketched throughout the process, and a runic piece is sewed into it. Small rune tattoos adorn Merlin, and the Green Knight has runes of some kind carved into his armor, although A24 will not give costume design shots to me, which I find very mean, honestly. Conjuring the Green Knight involves ripping a tooth from a skull, and as nature gets stronger, Arthur gets weaker. An interesting pattern considering once Arthur is in Morgan Le Fay's home, he complains of a toothache and digs at a tooth in approximately the same jaw position and the witchy tooth. Oh yeah, I guess we should talk about the unsettling blind lady in the room. There's a blindfolded woman who appears throughout the keep, even vibing in the bedroom with Gawain and the lady during a very, intimate moment. All hands on deck? I'm sorry about that. Anyway, the film itself doesn't give us any clue as to whether or not she is seen by the Lord and Lady, not just Gawain. She is, unfortunately, probably a tie to Gawain's mother, who wears the same white gauzy blindfold to conjure at the start of the film. VC Andrews would like a word, David Lowery. The Green Knight ends on an ambiguous note. We don't see the knight kill Gawain, but he does state, "Now, off with your head." This could be read as playful, a sign of hope, especially if you know how the poem ends, with the knight giving a teasing blow and letting Gawain go. Director David Lowery originally had Gawain beheaded and for good, but went with a more ambiguous ending for our own tender hearts. About that, moments foreshadowing the ultimate yeet and decease still remain. A puppet show recounts the tale of Christmas Day, spreading the story from King Arthur's court to the children in town. And just before Gawain's journey, forth the backdrop wheel turns to winter, and the Green Knight returning and beheading Gawain. Gawain has a vision after he's tied up by the scavengers in the forest. The camera spins to reveal the changing of seasons and his own skeletal remains, which awakens him, and fearfully, urgently he fights his way out of his bindings. Both imply that the beheading game is a cycle Gawain cannot escape, no matter what he chooses or what it costs him. Now let's talk about the big vision in that ending. The scene is filtered through a queer sort of green. There is a portrait behind King Gawain, but it's not the one painted of him earlier in the film. It's the strange pinpoint photograph that the lady took of him, and in its development has become entirely green. The crown Gawain wears is not Arthur's, but a crown of his own, and it becomes greener throughout the glimpse at his dystopian rule. His son dies in a battle not unlike the one he crosses with the scavenger, and the older woman giving him stern judgment as he arrives back to the yard is Essel. When Camelot begins to crumble, and Gawain's family and guards abandon him, the loop he pulls the green belt off through is pre-existing in his garb, implying he was ready for the death long before that moment. There's an especially sneaky Easter egg, or perhaps a Rorschach test. That old only Inti gent had some tricks up his sleeve yet. When Green Knight and Gawain meet in the chapel, his face has a few moments where it shifts ever so slightly in and out of more human face shapes, resembling both Ralph Ineson, who voiced the knight and thrilled us all previously in Eggers the Witch, and Joel Edgerton, who portrays the Lord, which you may remember is the knight's true identity in the epic. Some fans have seen King Arthur and even Gawain's own face in those brief shifts. But what about you? Did you see any other faces when you were watching the movie? Let us know down in the comments below. You know that in the final vision before Off With Your Head, the Queen, and presumably his daughter, rush out of the throne room before Gawain removes his green mantle once and for all. But a mid-credit scene shows a small girl with dark hair, perhaps the very same daughter, playing with his crown. It's possible this is another sign of hope that Gawain does make it out of that forest, or that in that vision of corruption, the Arthurian lineage still goes on through Gawain's bloodline. So how did Dev Patel and his paperback romance cover hair finally end up a leading man in a fantasy epic? Well, he wasn't initially on David Lowery's list of actors, but it was actually a fashion spread that inspired Lowery to meet with Patel. Quote, "From the moment I met him, I was very aware that he was going to be the thing that makes this film epic. I could always fall back on him because he will give us that in a close-up." At this meeting, Lowery showed Patel a drawing he had done of Patel on horseback, the moment he saw those regal images. Yeah, Dev Patel has that effect on a lot of people. The Green Knight playing in theaters is a different beast altogether from the first cut, and not just in the end. Lowery had the flu for most of production, and said the misery of that changed the way he shot the film back in 2019. The Green Knight was set to premiere at South by Southwest in early 2020, but Lowery was already in the process of pulling the film, unsatisfied with the final edit, before the festival was cancelled. He spent 6 months re-editing, implying the original cut was affected by his insecurities for filming while ill, saying, "I found the effect to cut it with love in my heart instead of with disappointment." Did you have the feeling this film was the eeriest ASMR? The incredible connection to nature doesn't stop with cinematography. Composer Daniel Hart uses birdsong, wood sound creaking, scratching, the sound of trees settling, falling over, and splitting throughout the entire score, entirely separate from practical sound mixing of such things. It fills the world with superstition and looming paganism, even when there aren't giants, talking critters, or conjured woodland knights on screen. Speaking of looming paganism, actor Ralph Ineson spent between 3 and 4 hours each morning having prosthetics applied and being painted. Designer Barry Gower created the prosthetics custom for the film, and it involved Ineson wearing an asymmetrical, unevenly weighed headpiece to get the wild look. This weight, plus the way the prosthetics affected his vision and hearing, required his ultimate focus, especially on horseback, leading Ineson to call this process quite meditative. If you left The Green Knight reminiscing about fantasy films of the 80s and 90s, that's no accident. Lowery wanted to hone in on practical effects and color technique, not just for the sake of an indie budget, but in direct homage to films like Ladyhawke, Dragon Slayer, and especially Willow. Ron Howard's 1988 fantasy adventure has a cult following, and Lowery is among those reverent masses. In fact, Lowery has said in several interviews that digging out his Willow action figures after reading Sir Gawain and The Green Knight is what really kick-started the screenplay process, and there's a direct homage to Mad Mardigan with a skeleton in a cage at a crossroads. Willow and fantasies weren't the only inspirations. All those gorgeous close-ups of Dev Patel that rely on his eyes as a storytelling device pulled from The Passion of Joan of Arc. Increasing drama and intensity and color schemes do it for you? Lowery took that approach from Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Francis ain't the only Coppola who left his mark on this tale. Lowery credits Sofia Coppola's Maria Antoinette with his decision to not shy away from anachronisms in costume and speech, which is what gives the world of The Green Knight its varied accents. Not one standard I am British and read books vibe. And finally, there are some real-world inspirations in long-held folklore that inspired the film. The mass grave, or lack thereof, we see post-battle is inspired by the Battle of Badon, which inspired a period of peace between Saxons and Celts, but only because of how horrific the loss was. The general mysticism of the woods and Gawain's journey aren't all from the epic poem, which doesn't show the journey that much, but pulled from folklore about Inglewood, a place folks are still superstitious about today. A knight in the streets gently placing a newly recovered skull in the sheets. Need me a freak like that. With David Lowery set to direct more fantasy for Disney, and Dev Patel set to continue being, Dev Patel, anything is possible for niche tales of chivalry. Now who will indulge me in like 100 more of these things?